Chapter 1. The Prize and the Unexpected Choice. The stellar arena on Savira, one of the galaxy's most notorious planets, was a place where the rich came to test their power and the poor came to fight for their freedom. The fight for survival had become a sport, a twisted entertainment for the elite. Gladiators, slaves, and captured alien beings were all brought here to entertain the masses with brutality. The more they fought, the higher their stakes. For some, a win meant wealth. For others, it meant life, but for the lucky ones, the prize was something far more coveted. As the crowd roared, under the blistering heat of the stadium lights, Caleb Rivers stood in the shadows behind the arena, watching the chaos unfold before him. He was no stranger to this place. As a mercenary and a former soldier, Caleb had participated in countless operations across the galaxy. But it was this deal, this opportunity that brought him here to Savira that had his heart racing. He had come for something special, the Queen's prize. Behind the iron bars of the holding cell, an alien woman stood chained, her back straight, her gaze unflinching. She was beautiful, in a way that Caleb could not ignore. Though she wore the marks of a slave, her arms and legs shackled with heavy metal chains that bound her to the cell. Her silver hair flowed down her back, shimmering in the harsh lights, and her violet eyes glowed like two burning stars. Her name was Lyra. Lyra was meant to be a trophy, a prize for the highest bidder. She was from a race of warriors, a species with extraordinary abilities and a legendary heritage. They were known across the galaxy as untamable and fierce, but Lyra had been captured during a raid and brought to the stellar arena as a captive. Caleb had seen many alien slaves before, but something about her struck him differently. There was strength in her eyes, a pride that hadn't been broken, even after everything she had endured. She was unlike any other prize he had come across. This wasn't a woman who would be content as a mere trophy. This was a woman who would fight, and fight hard. He couldn't help but feel an odd respect for her. Caleb's hand rested lightly on the blaster strapped to his side. His job was simple: buy her, take her, and sell her off to the highest bidder. He had no interest in alien women or slaves, but this particular auction had come with a hefty price tag. Lyra wasn't just anyone. She was worth more than gold or any precious gem in the galaxy. The richest and most influential individuals across the known worlds had placed their bets, and Caleb had come here to make sure he would walk away with her. But there was something different about this one. He knew it even before he had laid eyes on her. The bidding would be fierce, the stakes high, but Caleb didn't care about that. He had already made up his mind. He was going to take her, and once he did, he would see where this strange journey led. When the auctioneer called for the opening bid, Caleb stepped forward, his boots heavy on the cold floor of the arena. His signature coat fluttered behind him as he approached the platform, and his eyes locked onto Lyra's across the room. She didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge him. A strange feeling of disappointment washed over Caleb. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't desperate. She was defiant, even in chains. Caleb admired that. The auctioneer called out the price, setting the tone for what was about to be an intense bidding war. But just as Caleb prepared to raise his hand, he saw something, a glimmer of emotion in her eyes. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. For a brief second, she looked at him, as though she could see through him. And in that fleeting moment, Caleb felt something stir inside him. Fear? No. Compassion? No, not quite. But something closer to the feeling of an unfamiliar connection. Something that pulled at him in a way he hadn't felt in years. When the bidding began, Caleb didn't hesitate. He placed his first bid, and with it, the galaxy's richest joined in, each bidding war escalating with every second that passed. As the price grew, Caleb stayed calm, his resolve never wavering. His mental calculations were quick and precise. He knew what he was willing to pay. And, more importantly, he knew that this wasn't just about the prize. This was about something deeper, something he couldn't explain. He couldn't leave her to fall into the hands of these men. He couldn't let her be nothing more than a trophy to be paraded around like an object. And before he knew it, the bidding had stopped. Caleb Rivers had won. A few hours later, Caleb stood outside the auction hall, his eyes glancing back at the large spaceport in front of him. The ship he'd purchased would be his soon enough. But for now, it wasn't the ship that consumed his mind, it was Lyra. The slave was his, but at what cost? As he stepped into the private room where Lyra was held, he noticed how tense she was. The chains rattled softly as she moved, her violet eyes sharp, assessing, calculating. Her strength was clear. She didn't seem scared of him, or of anyone else. No, she was waiting. "You don't need to be afraid," Caleb said, his voice low and even. "I'm not going to sell you. You're not a prize for someone else. I've bought you, Lyra. I'm taking you with me." She raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Instead, she walked toward him, her steps graceful yet filled with purpose. When she stopped just inches away from him, she spoke, her voice like velvet cold, yet carrying the weight of someone who had endured far too much. "I'm not yours to claim. You paid for my chains, but I'll never be your prize." Her words stung, but Caleb refused to flinch. He stared her down, his resolve firm. "I didn't buy you to be a trophy. I bought you because I believe you deserve more than that. I don't know what your past was like, but I do know that I'm not going to treat you like a prize. You're free now, Lyra, and you can do whatever you want." Lyra paused, studying him for a long moment. She tilted her head as if weighing his words. "You think I'm free now?" Her voice was quiet, yet filled with sarcasm. "How do you think that will change things? Just because you bought me doesn't make me free." "It's a start," Caleb said firmly. He stepped forward, placing the key to her shackles in her hand. "A start to something new." Lyra looked at the key for a moment, her fingers brushing over it. Then, she looked up at him with a strange expression. It wasn't one of anger, nor resentment, but apprehension. She was unsure of him, of herself, and what her future now held. "If you think I'll just follow you like a docile slave, you're wrong," Lyra said, but there was something else in her eyes, curiosity, mixed with something she hadn't allowed herself to show for a long time. Hope. Caleb offered a slight smile. "I don't want you to follow me, Lyra. I want us to figure out where we go from here, together. I didn't save you to chain you again." Lyra paused. She eyed him again, this time with less hostility, but something new, something like understanding. "Why?" she asked simply, her voice softer now, still skeptical but open. "Why would you do this for me?" Caleb met her gaze without hesitation, his voice calm. "Because I believe you're worth more than the chains they put on you. You deserve a chance to live your own life. And maybe, I need someone who knows what it means to survive. Maybe I need you too." As the door to the ship closed behind them, Caleb could feel the weight of their shared moment hanging in the air. He had come for a prize, but he was walking away with something entirely different. As they made their way to the cockpit, Lyra stood beside him, her chains gone, but something new had formed between them. Something that would change everything. Chapter 2, Beyond Chains. The low hum of the ship's engines was a steady background noise as they ascended into the void of space. The Ravenous, as Caleb had named it, was not the most luxurious of ships. In fact, it was a far cry from the lavish palace-like vessels that some of the wealthiest families used. But it was reliable, fast, and fitted with enough tech for Caleb's needs. The cockpit was small, just enough space for the pilot seat, the navigation systems, and a few scattered personal items. It wasn't fancy, but it was home to him. Lyra stood by the entrance to the cockpit, her eyes locked on the vast expanse of space outside the window. Her gaze seemed to be searching for something deeper, something beyond what she had known her whole life. Caleb couldn't quite read her expression, but he could tell she was lost in thought. He finished adjusting the controls before turning his attention back to her. She was still wearing the tattered clothes from the auction, and though they were now free of chains, she still had the look of someone who had been broken, someone who had survived far more than a human should have to endure. But her eyes, their glow told a different story. They held strength, and something else Caleb wasn't prepared for: hope. "So, now what?" Lyra asked, her voice low but steady. There was no trace of anger in her tone anymore, just curiosity. "You saved me. You bought me. But now, I'm free, right? So, what comes next?" Caleb leaned back in his seat, his hands resting loosely on the controls. He could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air. What came next? That was the question. He had no answers, no plan. His life had been a series of chaotic decisions, one after the other, and the idea of keeping someone, especially someone like Lyra, was beyond his comprehension. The only thing he knew for certain was that she wasn't going back to the life she had come from. Not while he could help it. "We find a place for you to be free," he said simply, his voice low. "And if you want to come with me, we figure this thing out together. You're not my property, Lyra. You never were." Her expression softened just slightly, and Caleb caught a flicker of something relief. Maybe? He wasn't sure. But her gaze turned to the dark expanse of the stars again, as if she were contemplating something far beyond his reach. "You say you're not my owner, but you still bought me." Caleb didn't flinch. He'd expected this kind of reaction, the suspicion, the mistrust. After all, he had bought her not for a price, but to save her from becoming just another object for someone else to claim. Still, he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that she was questioning him, her trust in him still fragile, hanging on the thin edge of uncertainty. "I did," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But that's not how I see you. Not anymore. I didn't buy a prize. I bought your freedom, even if you don't believe that yet. I don't know what happened to you before, but I can promise you this ship, this moment, it's all yours, if you want it." Lyra didn't reply at first, and Caleb noticed the way her body tensed. Her jaw clenched ever so slightly. For a moment, he thought she was going to pull away, to walk out of the cockpit and disappear into the ship. But instead, she took a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing as she turned to face him. Her expression softened, though there was still a guarded look in her eyes. Guarded, but not entirely closed off. "Maybe I should be more like you, Caleb." Her voice was quieter now, softer than it had been before. "Maybe I should just accept what you say. That I'm free. That you saved me. But how can I trust you? I've never known anyone who gave me freedom without wanting something in return. I've never known kindness without strings attached." Caleb looked into her eyes, searching for something, anything that could show him what she was truly thinking. He didn't blame her for feeling that way. She had been used, abused, and betrayed by those who held power over her. The world she had come from was cruel, and Caleb knew better than anyone that trust was something that had to be earned. "I'm not asking you to trust me, Lyra." He shook his head, leaning forward slightly. "I'm just telling you the truth. You have a choice now. You don't have to go back to your cage, to your chains, to whatever people think you should be." Lyra exhaled sharply, turning her back to him once more. Her gaze returned to the stars outside, a soft exhale leaving her lips. "I don't know what it means to have a choice anymore." Her voice faltered slightly, and for the first time since he had met her, she seemed vulnerable, not the fierce alien woman he had come to respect. "I've been a weapon, a tool, a pawn in someone else's game for as long as I can remember." Caleb didn't know what to say, but he did know this. No matter how much she pushed him away, no matter how much hurt she had buried deep inside, she was still the same woman who had looked him in the eyes during the auction. The woman who had seen him and maybe, just maybe, could still trust him. "Then we start somewhere new, Lyra," he said, his voice firm but understanding. "I can't erase your past. I can't give you back the years you lost, but I can give you a future where you aren't anyone's prize, where you get to choose what you want to be. And if you want, you can choose to be with me." Lyra paused, and for a long moment, she didn't move. The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence that spoke of understanding, of two people from different worlds finding common ground. Finally, she turned to face him once more. Her eyes held a weight to them, one that Caleb hadn't expected. It wasn't gratitude, but something deeper, more complicated. "You're serious, aren't you?" she asked, almost as if she was testing him. "Dead serious," Caleb said, his tone unwavering. For the first time, a small smile tugged at the corners of Lyra's lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "Then, let's see what this freedom really means, Caleb. Let's see where this journey takes us." The ship's engines roared as they entered the deep reaches of space, far away from the auction house, far from the world that had held Lyra captive for so long. Together, they set course toward the unknown. There were still many questions ahead, and the road wouldn't be easy. But for now, they had each other. And for the first time in a long while, Lyra allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, freedom wasn't as far out of reach as it once seemed. Chapter 3: Echoes of the Past. The stars outside the cockpit window stretched into long, thin lines, the ship's warp drive engaging to push them further into the unknown. For the first time since she had met Caleb, Lyra allowed herself to lean back in the seat, taking a deep breath. The tension that had coiled around her body for so long began to loosen, if only a little. But the feeling of freedom was foreign to her. It didn't fit her past, didn't match the constant weight of the chains, both literal and metaphorical, that had been a part of her life for so long. Caleb had given her something she hadn't thought possible. He had freed her, but that freedom was like a fragile glass, a beautiful but easily shattered thing. "Where do we go from here?" she asked, turning to look at Caleb, who was busy navigating through the stars. His face was illuminated by the soft glow of the cockpit screens, his eyes focused but calm. His voice was steady when he answered, "Wherever you want to go, Lyra. This is your choice now." His words hung in the air, and for the first time, Lyra didn't have an immediate answer. Where did she want to go? She had been taught to follow orders, to submit to the whims of others, to fight, to survive. Now, freedom didn't just mean escaping physical chains, it meant choosing. But she wasn't used to having a choice. "I don't know," Lyra said softly, almost to herself. "I don't know where I belong anymore. I was raised as a weapon, trained to be nothing more than a tool. The only world I've ever known was one where I was always owned." Caleb glanced over at her. "You're not anyone's tool anymore, Lyra. Not mine, and not anyone else's." Her gaze softened at his words, and she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. She had heard kind words before, but this felt different. His sincerity wasn't just empty words. It was a promise, one that scared her, but also made her feel something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope. But the truth was, freedom was not something Lyra knew how to embrace. There was still a part of her that was trapped in the past, unable to let go of the fears she'd been trained to live with. The idea of trusting someone, truly trusting someone, was a challenge. Before she could voice her thoughts, a blaring alert sounded across the cockpit, breaking her train of thought. Caleb's hand flew to the controls as the ship's systems flashed warning signs. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath, quickly tapping at the controls to assess the situation. Lyra's eyes narrowed as she looked over his shoulder. On the display, a flickering image appeared. An inbound ship, right on their tail and fast. The ship's signature was unfamiliar, but its intentions weren't. It was hunting them. "They're after us," Caleb said, his voice tight with urgency. "We've got incoming, and it doesn't look like friendly company." Lyra's pulse quickened. The freedom she had just started to feel now seemed like an illusion. Danger was never far from her, and she had just left one prison, only to end up on the run again. "Who are they?" Lyra asked, her voice more firm than she had anticipated. She was no stranger to battle, but she wasn't used to feeling so vulnerable. Caleb's hands flew over the ship's console, his eyes scanning the data coming in at lightning speed. "It's a bounty ship. The Ravagers, a group of mercenaries. It looks like they were hired to track us down. We've been compromised." "Bounty hunters?" Lyra asked with a soft growl in her voice. Her fingers tightened into fists. "I should have known. Of course they would send people after me." Caleb turned to face her, his expression more intense now. Asterisk, they're after both of us now. You're no longer just a slave to them, Lyra. You're a target, but we'll outrun them. I can handle this." Lyra hesitated for a moment before standing up and moving toward the shield's panel. "I can fight too." Caleb raised an eyebrow, but there was no time for debate. The Ravagers had found them, and there was no escaping their firepower if they weren't ready. "You're not a weapon anymore, Lyra. I'm not going to let them turn you back into one." Caleb's voice was firm, but Lyra could hear the worry in it. He didn't want to see her hurt, didn't want her to fight if she didn't have to. She paused, looking at him, her chest tightening. A strange warmth spread through her, not fear, but recognition. He was protecting her not as a trophy, not as something he owned, but because he cared. "I'll fight, Caleb. I have no other choice." Her voice was steady, and as she moved to the ship's rear hatch, she could hear the whir of the ship's weapons systems coming to life. She wasn't a defenseless woman anymore, and she refused to feel like one. The Ravagers had underestimated them. Caleb was a fighter, and so was she. They weren't just a pair of fugitives, they were now a team. The space around them seemed to warp as the ship sped up. The Ravager's ship was fast, but Caleb had years of experience evading pursuit. He adjusted the thrusters, throwing the ship into a sharp turn, making a hard dodge through the asteroid field that lay between them and the open expanse of space. "Hold on," Caleb shouted as the Ravenous jolted with every sharp turn and sudden change in velocity. Lyra's heart raced as the vibrations of the ship echoed through her, but she held steady at the rear turret. A quick glance at the display showed the Ravagers gaining on them, but their ship was still far from the targeting range. She focused, feeling the familiar pull of adrenaline, the clarity of battle surging through her veins. The turret was a simple but effective weapon, nothing too fancy, but more than enough for what they needed. She lined up the targeting reticule and took a breath. "This is where we make our stand, Caleb." Her voice was calm, precise. She was ready. A blazing volley of laser fire erupted from the rear of the ship, the Ravagers' ship's shields flickering as their ship tried to maneuver out of the way. Lyra's aim was true. With every shot, she could feel the tension between her and the mercenaries growing. They had no idea what they were up against. Caleb grinned. "Nice shot. Keep them on their toes. We're almost there." The distance between them and the Ravagers was closing fast, but they had gained some ground. Caleb's hands flew across the controls again, the ship's thrusters burning bright as they shot forward. Just then, a blinding flash of light erupted from the Ravagers' ship as they fired their main cannon at the Ravenous. The shields hummed under the strain as the energy blast collided with them, sending a shudder through the entire ship. "Hang on," Caleb shouted again, his eyes darting to the console, desperate to stabilize the ship. The shield levels were dangerously low. Lyra's hands tightened around the controls. She could feel the weight of her decision pressing in, but there was no turning back now. Not for either of them. "We need a diversion," Lyra shouted, as her hands flew to the ship's other weapon systems, quickly making adjustments. Her heart raced, the safety of both their lives now depending on their skill. "I've got something," Caleb shouted back. He reached forward, pulling the lever to release the cloaking device. In an instant, the Ravenous vanished from sight. The Ravagers fired, their shots missing the mark as the ship slid into stealth mode. Lyra's heart skipped a beat as she finally allowed herself a small breath. They had done it. Now, they just had to stay ahead. Chapter 4, The Final Stand. The Ravenous was still cloaked, drifting through the void of space like a silent ghost. The Ravagers, unable to track them, had dispersed into the asteroid belt, searching blindly. The ship was safer now. Inside the cockpit, Lyra leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, her hands still clenched from the intensity of the battle. The rush of combat was familiar, but this time, something was different. She wasn't fighting alone. She wasn't fighting just to survive. She was fighting for something more. For the first time in her life, she had a choice. Caleb, still at the controls, exhaled a long breath as he scanned the monitors. The Ravagers had given up, at least temporarily. His fingers relaxed over the console, but his mind was still sharp, still alert for any sign of pursuit. "That was too close," he muttered, shaking his head. He turned toward Lyra, who was watching him with an unreadable expression. "You okay?" Lyra nodded slowly, but something in her eyes told him she wasn't just thinking about the fight. There was something deeper bothering her, something that had been gnawing at her since the moment she set foot on this ship. "You know they'll come after us again, right?" she finally said. Caleb met her gaze. "I know, but we'll be ready for them." Lyra sighed, pushing away from the wall and walking toward the cockpit window. The stars stretched infinitely before them, endless and open, just like the future she never thought she'd have. She had been owned, controlled, shackled, but now, the universe itself was at her feet. And yet, her past was still out there. "This isn't over, Caleb," she murmured. "They won't stop coming. Not just the Ravagers. The Tarn. The ones who sold me. The ones who think I belong to them. As long as I live, I'll always be hunted." Caleb stood up from the pilot's seat and walked over to her, standing by her side. The soft glow of the ship's navigation lights illuminated them in the darkness of space. "Then we fight," he said simply. Lyra turned to face him, her violet eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. But there was none. He meant every word. "You'd fight for me?" she asked, voice quieter now. Caleb didn't hesitate. "I already did, and I'd do it again." He looked at her, really looked at her. "You're not a prize, Lyra. You never were. But I don't think you realize just how much you matter." Lyra swallowed hard, feeling an unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest. He wasn't just saying what she wanted to hear, he believed it. She had been thrown into his world, chained and alone. But now she wasn't just a survivor. She was something more. And Caleb? He wasn't just a mercenary anymore. He was something more to her, too. She exhaled slowly. I don't know how to live without chains, Caleb. But maybe I can learn. A small smile tugged at his lips. Then let's figure it out. Together. For the first time in her life, Lyra felt free. Epilogue. A new beginning. The Ravenous soared through the darkness of space, leaving behind the past and heading toward a future that neither Caleb nor Lyra fully understood. But it didn't matter. Because, for the first time, they weren't running alone. They were together. And that was enough.